They whispered as she walked down the aisle. 22. Homeless, marrying a 73-year-old billionaire. Gold digger, they said, and Edward Langston believed every word. He watched her closely, testing her, leaving stacks of cash within reach, staging cruel little traps, waiting for her to slip. But she never touched a dollar, never defended herself, just smiled politely and disappeared every morning before sunrise. One night, suspicion won, and he followed her through cold city streets, past glass towers into a rundown neighborhood where she handed envelopes of money to strangers in need. Edward's jaw tightened. So it's true, he muttered, until he grabbed one envelope after she left and froze. It wasn't his money. It was hers, earned from overnight shifts, labeled with names, bills, medicine, hope. When he confronted her, voice sharp, she didn't cry, didn't beg. She just looked at him and said, "You never asked." And in that moment, everything he thought he knew about her, and himself, began to break. If you think she married him for money, you're not alone. The room is silent, heavy with judgment, as Sophie Hale stands beneath the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, her simple white dress a quiet contrast to the sea of tailored suits and diamond necklaces around her. And beside her stands Edward Langston, 73, a man whose name alone built empires. His expression unreadable as whispers ripple through the crowd like a low storm. Gold digger, opportunist, child marrying a fortune. And Sophie hears every word, but her face doesn't change, not even a flicker, because she has heard worse, lived worse, survived worse, and this is just another room where she doesn't belong. Edward watches her from the corner of his eye, calculating, measuring, wondering how someone so young could step into a world like his without trembling, without greed showing in her eyes, because he has seen it before, countless times, people drawn to his wealth like moths to light. But Sophie, she is different, and that unsettles him more than anything. The officiant's voice fades into the background as Edward studies her hands. No designer nails, no expensive jewelry, just stillness, controlled, almost too calm. And when she says, "I do," her voice is steady, not excited, not emotional, just certain. And that word lingers longer than it should. Hours later, the mansion is alive with celebration, laughter echoing through marble halls, champagne flowing. But Sophie stands near a window alone, her reflection faint against the glass, watching a world she has entered but not embraced. And Edward notices, of course he does, because men like him notice everything. And something about her distance irritates him, as if she isn't playing the role he expected, as if she doesn't care enough to pretend. He approaches her slowly, his voice low, controlled. "You're very convincing," he says, and she turns, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Convincing?" she repeats softly, and for a second, just a second, he almost questions himself. But then the thought returns, sharp and familiar. No one marries a man like me without wanting something. No one. And he leans closer, just enough for only her to hear. "Let's not pretend this is anything more than an arrangement." And instead of reacting, instead of defending herself, Sophie simply nods. "I never said it was." And that answer lands harder than any accusation, because there is no guilt in it, no fear, just truth, or at least, something that feels like it. And as she turns back toward the window, Edward feels it for the first time. Not suspicion, not control, but something far more unsettling. A question he cannot yet answer. "The rules are simple," Edward says the next morning, his voice as sharp as the morning light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You will attend every public event. You will represent this family with dignity, and you will not make me regret this decision." And Sophie stands across from him in the vast dining room, the table between them long enough to feel like a border, her posture straight, her hands folded lightly in front of her, as if she has already memorized the space. "I understand," she replies, calm, steady, and that same composure unsettles him again because it feels rehearsed yet somehow real at the same time. Breakfast is served, but she barely touches it, not out of nerves but out of habit, as if hunger is something she has learned to ignore. And Edward notices everything. The way she thanks the staff by name after hearing it once. The way she does not linger near luxury, but moves through it like a guest who refuses to unpack. And it irritates him more. than greed ever could. Later that afternoon, he begins his first test, subtle, almost invisible, a leather envelope left casually. On a side table in the sitting room, thick with cash, enough to change a life in seconds, and he watches from the hallway, unseen, as Sophie enters, pauses, notices it immediately, her eyes resting on it for exactly one breath longer than necessary. And then, she walks past it, not faster, not slower, just as if it never existed, and Edward's jaw tightens because that is not how this is supposed to go. Days pass, and the tests continue. A designer bracelet placed in her room without explanation. A credit card offered with no limits. Invitations to exclusive boutiques where anything could be hers. And every time she responds the same way. Polite refusal, quiet distance, never dramatic, never defensive, just consistent. And consistency is harder to fake than charm. At a high-profile charity gala 3 nights later, the kind where reputations are built and destroyed in a single conversation, Sophie stands beside him in a simple black dress, elegant but not extravagant, and the whispers. Return, louder this time, more direct, one woman smiling sweetly as she leans in. You must feel very lucky, she says, her tone laced with something colder beneath it. And Sophie meets her gaze with the same calm expression. I feel grateful, she answers, nothing more, nothing less. And when a server nearby stumbles slightly, nearly dropping a tray, Sophie moves without hesitation, steadying it, helping quietly, thanking him instead of drawing attention, and Edward sees it, the way she chooses kindness when no one important is watching, the way she never once looks toward him for approval. And something shifts, small but undeniable. That night, as the mansion settles into silence, Edward stands alone in his study, replaying every moment, every test that should have exposed her, every opportunity she should have taken, and instead of answers he finds something far more dangerous growing in his mind. Doubt. Not about her intentions, but about his certainty, because for the first time in years, Edward Langston is no longer sure he is right. People reveal who they are when no one is watching. Edward murmurs to himself the next morning, standing behind the sheer curtains of his study as the first light of dawn stretches across the estate, and right on time, just as it has been for the past 3 days, Sophie slips quietly out of the front door, dressed simply. Nothing like the woman the world now believes she is. Edward watches her go, something tighter than curiosity pulling at him now, something closer to obsession, because nothing about her behavior aligns with the story he has already decided is true, and for a man like him, uncertainty is unacceptable. Within minutes, he is in the back seat of a black car, instructing his driver to keep distance, to follow but not be seen. And the city slowly changes as they move, glass towers fading into older buildings, clean sidewalks giving way to cracked pavement, until finally Sophie steps out near a neighborhood Edward has not visited in decades, if ever, and without hesitation she walks forward, not like someone lost, but like someone returning. Edward stays inside the car at first, watching through tinted glass as she disappears into a small corner building, its sign flickering faintly, and after a long moment, he steps out, drawn forward by something he cannot name, moving closer until he can see through the window. And what he sees does not make sense, because Sophie is not alone. She is surrounded by people, older men, young mothers, a few children sitting quietly, and she is speaking softly, handing out small envelopes one by one, listening more than she talks, her expression different here, warmer, lighter, like this is the place where she allows herself to exist fully. Edward's eyes narrow, his mind immediately searching for the simplest explanation. His money, it has to be. His money, filtered, hidden, redistributed. The classic story he has seen too many times before, and yet something feels off, something does not align with the precision he expects from deception, because there is no performance in her movements, no urgency, no fear of being caught, only quiet intention. He waits until she leaves, keeping his distance as she disappears down the street, and then he steps inside the building. The air warmer than outside, but heavy with stories he does not understand. And on a small table near the entrance, he sees one of the envelopes she handed out, forgotten or perhaps left behind. And without thinking, he picks it up, his fingers brushing against the worn paper. And for a moment, he hesitates, because opening it feels like crossing a line, But then again, lines have never stopped him before. Inside is cash, modest, not excessive, folded carefully, and a note written in neat handwriting. For medication this week. Please take care. And Edward's breath stills for just a second, not because of the money, but because of what is missing. There is no signature tied to him, no trace of his accounts, no connection to his name. And that should not be possible, because he has monitored every transaction, every account, every movement since she entered his life. Confusion settles in, deeper than suspicion, and as he steps back out into the cold morning air, one thought echoes louder than the rest. If this is not his money, then where is it coming from? And for the first time since their marriage, Edward Langston realizes he is no longer in control of the narrative he thought he understood. You should have taken the money. It would have made this easier, Edward says quietly that evening, his voice carrying a weight that did not exist before. As Sophie steps into the mansion, the door closing softly behind her, her coat still carrying the chill of the outside world. And for the first time since their marriage, she pauses, not out of fear, but because something in his tone feels different, sharper, less certain. She turns slowly, meeting his gaze as he stands in the dim light of the foyer, no longer the untouchable figure of control, but a man holding a question he does not know how to ask. And for a moment neither of them speaks, the silence stretching until it almost becomes something else entirely. Where did the money come from? He asks finally, direct, controlled, but not as confident as before, and Sophie studies him, not offended, not defensive, just tired, as if this moment has been waiting for them longer than either of them realized. Why does it matter? She replies softly, and that answer frustrates him more than any lie could, because it refuses to play by his rules. He steps closer, not aggressive, but firm, because I have watched every account, every transaction, every movement since you entered my life, and none of it leads back to me, he says, each word measured. So I will ask again. Where does it come from? And this time, Sophie exhales slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly, as if she is deciding whether he deserves the truth or not, and that thought alone unsettles him more than anything else. I work, she says simply, and the words land heavier than expected, because they do not match the image he has built in his mind. At night, she adds, after everyone here goes to sleep. And Edward's expression shifts, not disbelief exactly, but something close to it, because the idea of her choosing to work, choosing struggle when comfort is freely offered, does not fit into any version of reality he understands. You expect me to believe that? He asks, quieter now, and Sophie's lips press together for a brief second before she answers. You do not have to believe anything, she says, her voice steady but no longer distant. You just have to decide whether you want to keep assuming. And there it is again, that line between them, not drawn by wealth or power, but by something far more difficult to cross, perspective. Edward looks at her, really looks this time, at the absence of fear in her eyes, at the quiet strength that does not demand attention. And something inside him shifts again, deeper now, because for the first time, he is not certain he has been testing her, but rather revealing himself. Why marry me then? He asks, the question finally escaping, stripped of accusation, almost honest, and Sophie holds his gaze for a long second before answering. Because I needed a place where I would not have to run anymore, she says. And the simplicity of that truth lands harder than anything else she could have said, because it is not about money, not about status, but about something he has never had to consider, survival without security. And as she turns to walk away, leaving him standing in a silence that feels heavier than before, Edward realizes something he cannot ignore anymore. The more he tries to prove who she is, the more he is forced to confront who he has been all along. The truth is, I never needed your money, Sophie says softly the next morning, her voice cutting through the quiet of the breakfast room before Edward can even sit down, and the statement lingers in the air, heavier than any accusation, because it challenges everything he has believed since the moment she entered his life. Edward pauses, his hand resting on the back of the chair, studying her as she calmly pours herself a glass of water, her movements unhurried, unaffected, as if she has already moved past the conversation that still holds him in place, and that unsettles him more than any confrontation ever could. Then what do you need? He asks, his tone lower now, less commanding, more searching, and Sophie does not answer immediately, not because she is avoiding the question, but because she is choosing her words carefully, something he is only now beginning to recognize. Stability, she finally says, her eyes meeting his, steady and clear. A place where I can stop starting over. And Edward exhales slowly, the simplicity of her answer landing deeper than expected, because it is not a demand, not a manipulation, just a truth he has never had to live. The room falls quiet again, but this time it feels different, less like distance and more like something shifting beneath the surface, something fragile that neither of them fully understands yet. Later that day, Edward does something he has not done in years. He cancels meetings, ignores calls, and instead walks through parts of his own company he usually only sees through reports, observing quietly, listening more than speaking, and for the first time, he notices the small things, the way employees avoid eye contact, the tension behind polite smiles, the distance between leadership and the people who actually keep everything running, and without realizing it, he begins to see the world the way Sophie might see it, not from the top, but from somewhere much lower, much closer to reality. That evening, he returns home earlier than usual, and instead of retreating to his study, he finds Sophie in the kitchen, not being served, not surrounded by staff, but standing alone, quietly helping one of the housekeepers prepare a simple meal, her sleeves rolled slightly, her movements natural, unforced, and for a moment he simply watches, unnoticed, because what he sees does not match the version of her he has been trying to prove. There is no performance here, no audience, just intention. You do not have to do that, he says finally, stepping forward, and Sophie turns, a small hint of surprise crossing her face before it settles back into calm. I know, she replies, and then, after a brief pause, but I want to. And that answer stays with him longer than it should, because it is not about obligation, not about expectation, but about choice, something he is beginning to realize he has misunderstood entirely. Later that night, as Edward sits alone in his study once again, the envelope from the neighborhood still resting on his desk, he opens it one more time, reading the simple note inside, and for the first time, he does not look at it as evidence, but as something else entirely, a reflection of a life he has never had to live. And as that realization settles in, one question rises above all the others, quiet but impossible to ignore. If she never needed his money, then what exactly has she been giving him all along? Control is a fragile illusion, especially when you finally see what you have been blind to, Edward says quietly to himself as he stands in the doorway of his study, the envelope still in his hand. But this time it feels heavier, not because of what is inside, but because of what it represents. And for the first time in decades, he does something unfamiliar. He decides not to investigate further, not to dig for proof, but to observe, to understand, and that decision alone begins to change everything. Over the next few days, Edward stops setting traps, stops placing money in plain sight, stops testing Sophie altogether, and instead, he starts paying attention, not to what he expects to see, but to what is actually there. And the difference is subtle but undeniable. He notices how she greets every staff member with the same respect she shows him, how she remembers details others overlook, how she listens fully when someone speaks, as if their words carry equal weight regardless of status. And each of these small moments chips away at the certainty he once held so tightly. One evening, he follows her again, but this time without suspicion, without the need to catch her in something. And when she arrives at the same neighborhood, he does not hide behind tinted glass. He steps out, keeping his distance, but no longer pretending he is invisible. And once again he sees her among the same people, offering quiet support, not just money, but time, conversation, presence, things he has never considered valuable because they cannot be measured. And for the first time, Edward feels something unfamiliar rising in his chest, not doubt, not control, but something closer to respect. Later that night, as they sit across from each other in the quiet of the living room, the distance between them feels different now, less like a barrier and more like something waiting to be crossed. And Edward speaks first, not with authority, but with something quieter. I went back there, he admits, and Sophie looks at him, her expression unreadable, but not surprised, as if she always knew this moment would come. "I saw what you do," he continues, his voice steady but softer than before. "And I realized I do not understand it." And for the first time, there is no accusation in his words, only honesty. Sophie studies him for a long moment before responding. "You are not supposed to understand it," she says gently. "You are supposed to feel it." And that answer settles deeper than any explanation could, because it shifts the conversation away from logic and into something far more uncomfortable for a man like Edward, something he cannot control or quantify. He leans back slightly, absorbing her words, and for a moment, the room falls silent again. But this silence is not heavy. It is open, uncertain, and filled with something new, possibility. "And what do you feel?" he asks finally, and Sophie hesitates, just for a second, before answering. "I feel like I am finally not invisible." And that answer changes something in him, something fundamental, because it forces him to confront a truth he has never considered, that in all his power, in all his wealth, he may have spent years overlooking the very people who matter most. And as that realization settles in, Edward understands that the greatest shift is no longer about who Sophie is, but about who he is becoming. Sometimes the hardest truth to face is the one that shows you who you have been all along, Edward says under his breath as he stands in the boardroom days later, surrounded by executives who have spent years agreeing with everything he says. And for the first time, he notices it, the silence before they respond, the way they wait for his approval before forming their own opinions, and it reminds him of something Sophie said, about being invisible, about not being seen, and suddenly he realizes he has been the one deciding who gets seen and who does not. The meeting continues, numbers, projections, strategies, but Edward is no longer fully present, because his mind keeps drifting back to the small room in that neighborhood, to the way Sophie listened to people as if their stories mattered. And he begins to question something he has never questioned before, not the business, not the results, but the way he has built everything, the way he has led, and more importantly, the cost of it. Later that afternoon, he makes a decision that surprises even himself. He cancels a major deal, one that would have brought in millions, because it involves cutting jobs, and for the first time, profit is not the only factor in his calculation. And when his executives push back, confused, even concerned, Edward does not explain, because he does not yet have the words. He only has a feeling, something new, something uncomfortable, but something he knows he cannot ignore. That evening, he returns home earlier again, and this time, instead of finding Sophie working quietly or keeping her distance, he finds her sitting alone on the back steps, looking out at the wide stretch of land behind the mansion, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and blue. And for a moment, he hesitates, unsure if he belongs in this quiet space she has created, but then he walks forward anyway, sitting beside her without saying a word, and the silence between them feels different now, not empty, but shared. "I changed something today," he says after a long pause, his voice softer than it has ever been, and Sophie glances at him, curious but not surprised. "Was it the right thing?" she asks gently, and Edward exhales, looking out at the horizon. "I do not know," he admits, "but it felt like it mattered," and Sophie nods slightly, as if that answer is enough, as if feeling something is already a step forward. The moment lingers, quiet but meaningful, until Edward turns to her, something heavier now behind his eyes, something unresolved. "Why did you never tell me?" he asks, not accusing, just asking, and Sophie considers the question carefully before answering. "Because you were not ready to hear it," she says, and that truth lands without resistance. Because he knows she is right. He knows that if she had told him everything from the beginning, he would have dismissed it, reduced it, misunderstood it, just like he did everything else. The air grows still again, but this time, it carries something deeper, something closer to understanding, and as Edward sits there beside her, watching the last light fade, he realizes something that changes everything, not just about Sophie, but about himself, that the life he thought he had built on certainty was actually built on assumptions, and now, for the first time, those assumptions are beginning to fall apart, one quiet truth at a time. The moment you realize you were wrong is the moment everything can change, Edward says quietly as he stands at the edge of the grand ballroom. The same kind of room where everything once felt predictable, controlled, and now feels unfamiliar, almost fragile, as the annual foundation gala unfolds around him. Guests dressed in elegance, conversations flowing, cameras flashing. But tonight, for the first time, Edward is not focused on appearances. He is focused on something far more difficult. Truth. Across the room, Sophie stands near a small group of guests, not commanding attention, not seeking it, but somehow drawing it anyway. Her presence calm, grounded, real in a space that often feels anything but, and Edward watches her, not with suspicion, not with calculation, but with something new, something closer to clarity, because now he sees what he could not see before, not just what she does, but who she is. The room quiets as Edward steps forward, the subtle shift in energy, signaling that something is about to happen, and for a moment, he feels it, that old instinct to control the narrative, to shape the moment into something polished and safe, but he lets it go, because for once, this is not about control, it is about honesty. He reaches the center of the room, the lights reflecting off polished floors, and as the attention settles on him, he speaks. His voice steady but stripped of its usual distance. I built my life believing I understood people, he begins. The words surprising even himself. I believed that success gave me clarity, that experience gave me judgment. He pauses, glancing briefly toward Sophie, who meets his gaze without expectation, without fear, just quiet presence. But I was wrong. And the words land heavier than anything else he could have said, because they are not part of a speech. Not part of a strategy, they are simply true. A ripple moves through the room. Subtle but undeniable. As Edward continues, I thought I could measure people the same way I measure business, through patterns, through outcomes, through what they gain. His voice softened slightly. And in doing so, I overlooked something far more important. Who they are when no one is watching. And now the room is completely still, every word carrying weight, every moment stretching longer than expected. He turns fully towards Sophie now, not as a billionaire addressing a crowd, but as a man addressing someone who changed him. I misjudged the person standing beside me, he says, his voice steady but no longer guarded. I believed she entered my life for the wrong reasons, and because of that belief, I failed to see the truth that was right in front of me. And Sophie's expression shifts just slightly, not with surprise, but with something softer, something that recognizes the moment for what it is. Edward takes a breath, something he has not needed to steady himself in years, and continues. She gave, without recognition, helped without expectation, and lived with a strength I did not understand because I never had to. His voice lowers, more personal now. And instead of asking, instead of listening, I assumed. And the final word lingers, not as a conclusion, but as a confession. The room remains silent, but the silence has changed, no longer filled with judgment, but with something closer to reflection. And as Edward stands there, no longer hiding behind certainty, he realizes that this moment is not about correcting a mistake. It is about acknowledging a truth, one that will not only change how others see Sophie, but how he chooses to see the world from this moment forward. The truth does not change who you are. It reveals who you have chosen to become, Edward says quietly as the room slowly exhales around him, the tension dissolving into something softer, something more human, and for a moment, he does not move, does not return to the safety of distance or authority, because this is the first time in years he has stood in front of others without armor. The silence breaks into gentle applause, not loud, not overwhelming, but genuine, and Edward does not look at the crowd. He looks only at Sophie, because for the first time, their connection is not defined by assumption or distance, but by understanding. She steps toward him. Slowly, her expression calm but no longer guarded, and when she stops in front of him, there is no hesitation in her voice. You did not have to do that, she says softly, and Edward shakes his head slightly, a small, almost unfamiliar smile touching his expression. Yes, I did, he replies, and for the first time, those words carry no obligation, only truth. The evening continues, but something has shifted permanently, not just in how others see them, but in how they see each other. And in the days that follow, that shift begins to take form in ways neither of them expected. Edward restructures part of his foundation, not as a public gesture, but as a reflection of what he has learned, creating programs that focus not just on financial aid, but on presence, on listening, on giving people the space to be seen. And he does not put his name at the center of it. Instead, quietly, he names it after something simple, something meaningful, something he once overlooked. Sophie continues her routines, but now they are no longer hidden, no longer separate from the life they share. And sometimes, Edward joins her, not as a leader, not as a benefactor, but as someone learning, observing, understanding a world he once believed he had already mastered. One evening, as they stand together outside the same small building where everything began to change, Edward looks at her, not with doubt, not with calculation, but with something steady, something real. "I spent my life building everything I thought mattered," he says, his voice quieter now, shaped by experience instead of certainty. "And I still missed the most important part." And Sophie meets his gaze, her expression soft but grounded. "You did not miss it," she replies gently. "You just had not seen it yet." And that difference matters more than he can fully explain. The air is calm, the city moving quietly around them. And for a moment, neither of them speaks, because not every truth needs words. And as Edward stands there, no longer trying to control what comes next, he realizes something he never expected, that for the first time in his life, he is not measuring what he gains, but appreciating what he has finally found, not in wealth, not in power, but in understanding, in connection, in the quiet presence of someone who never needed his money, only the chance to be seen. And as he turns slightly toward her, his voice softer than it has ever been, carrying not authority but intention, he asks a question he has never asked anyone before, not as a businessman, not as a man in control, but simply as himself. "Would you stay? Not because you have to, but because you want to?" And Sophie does not answer immediately, not because she is uncertain, but because for the first time, the choice is truly hers. And as she looks at him, the silence between them is no longer filled with doubt, but with possibility, leaving behind a single question that neither of them rushes to resolve, because this time, the truth is not something to uncover, but something they are only just beginning to live.